This is Lecture 11 for the Introduction to Environmental Science, starting off with a pop quiz about food deserts. According to the article, hot link below, moving farmers markets through more poor shoppers. What's the definition of food desert? Post your answer to the drop box by 7 a.m. on the last day of Unit 3. Up to 10 extra credit points for the assessment part of your grade. Extra credit A. So, population growth, resource use, and sustainability. That's what we're about in this particular lecture. This is an image of a guy basically taking care of a bunch of, whoops, what happened there? That's not supposed to happen. Try that again. There we go. Yes. Maize. Whether it's sustainable or not, well, we'll talk about that later. So where are we? Since the invention, I like that word, and we invented agriculture. Well, I guess we did, didn't we? So, mechanized agriculture, mechanized suburbs. Population has gone from 5 million people up to 7.4 billion people. Ag developed simultaneously globally. We saw that developed in several places in the last lecture. The Industrial Revolution, mechanization. Now we can do 1,000 times more work than that was done by hand. But at what cost or what benefit? In 1920, a while back, 50% of the U.S. population was in agriculture. 70 years later, that number had dropped down to 2%. That's a big drop. We have brought great changes to our environment, but it has been done to support our very much growing population. Just think how much the population of the world has grown since 1920. So, the solution to pollution is dilution probably worked pretty well in 1920, but it doesn't really work all that well today. And we'll delve more into that in a future lecture. So we're going to talk about sustainable resource use, a balance between supply and demand. Race to feed the world. We certainly are, well, winning that race in places. Talk about the green revolution, something we sort of take for granted. I'm not talking about a political revolution here. Sustainability can be limited by what we do with those resources. Biofuels, ethanol is one of those biofuels. Are we growing corn to put gas in our tanks or ethanol in our tanks of our cars, or are we feeding people? Feedlots versus free-range ways of growing things. Sustainable agriculture and the developing world. I'm going to talk about types of sustainable agriculture. Inorganic versus organic fertilizers. Swidden agriculture versus industrial ag, and agricultural self-sufficiency. The trade-off between sustainability and productivity. We've made that trade-off and we continue to do that. Can we change how we do it? And fisheries. There's a fisheries assignment that you may already be able to see if you've gotten far enough in the course. Content section, put the answers in the drop box. That should be available shortly if it's not available now. Environmental sustainability. The ability to sustain and exploit, I hate the way I said that, natural capital to meet growing human needs. You'd think I could get it right, but anyway. Agriculture is definitely something we have exploited. Fisheries, we exploit those all the time. Sustainable yield is the same thing as environmental sustainability in this case. So what's sustainable is going right along this line right here, where output is equal to input. If we're really going to be sustainable, we really want to have more left over at the end of our use. Sustainable resource use is constrained by supply and demand. If you use it up faster than the resources being supplied, then, well, that's a bad thing. Rate at which resource use is being used, consumed, and harvested. So, rate at which resources are being supplied as opposed to rate at which they're being used. And when the supply is being used up faster than they can be replenished, then that's not sustainable. So some terminology. Resources harvested periodically to allow for regeneration to a pre-harvest level. It's true for all resources. Yield, like that word, amount of resource harvested, however you harvest it, per unit time. Rotation period, harvest interval, period of time for the resource to return to the levels of the previous harvest. I'll use a tree example a bit later, but it can take 30 years for a piece of land to regrow trees. So that would be the rotation period. From the time you harvest to the time you can harvest again, that is the period of time for that resource to recover. For sustained yield, similar yield at each harvest, the resource must recover to pre-harvest levels. Sometimes we have to help that along. We have to, fertilize, for example. These terms are used extensively in sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, and this wild fisheries management we'll look at later. So world population has certainly increased over this period of time, 1950 to predicted into 2050 we've seen this before, 9 billion people. Cereal crop production is sort of predicted to do the same thing, because really most of what we feed ourselves with is wheat, other cereal sorts of crops. We are producing more food per person. Back in 1960, we produced about 1 billion tons per year, and it's projected that by 2050 we'll be producing 4 billion for a population in 1960 of about 3 billion people versus a population of 9 billion people. How are we doing this? How are we producing more crops with really the same amount of land? We don't have more land. Intensive agriculture. Can we keep it up? Will the environment let us? Can we continue to grow, without limit? So it's percent worldwide of undernourished people. Throughout the world, it's declining. You can see what that graph is, but let's highlight a couple of numbers. First of all, in 2006, 17% of people worldwide were undernourished. Go forward to 2013, and that number has dropped to 13%. That is really a pretty good drop in a fairly short period of time. So are we doing a better job of nourishing people over that fairly short period of time? Let's see if we can keep that up. To recall that a lot of this predates the previous graph. Proportion of underweight children 2004-2005 in India was quite high, 2 billion plus out of 7.4 billion really are undernourished. Undernutrition may receive enough calories and protein, but not those essential nutrients. More susceptible to many diseases. And then you have this idea of overnutrition. And it actually is, we're not talking about somebody getting fat, we're talking about diets. This goes back to that food desert that is in the pop quiz. Read about that. Diets are dominated by pre-processed foods, calorie-rich, but nutrient-poor. You can even get nutrient supplements, but that doesn't mean that you're not getting sort of fresh fruits and vegetables that you really need to be healthy. So the Green Revolution. We've been running out of land also as the population increases, so we grow more crops. A guy named Norman Burlag introduced high-yield, disease-resistant wheat to Mexico, spread throughout the developing world. What he did was, comparing, look at this graph, starting in 1961, the production was approximately 1,000 million metric tons, 1 billion metric tons per year. Increased the production from 1961 to about 2005 to approximately 2.25 billion tons of cereal produced. That's how much was produced, but we're still working with the same amount of land. about or 500. The area harvested is about 500 million hectares. Still, hasn't changed very much over that period of time. So he received received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and he's credited with saving more than 1 billion lives because we're able to feed more people now because of this green revolution. But there are some mixed results. Well, positives, of course. Better production from already farmed land. 1961-2010, food production tripled. Per person food production increased by 48%. That's the green revolution. And as we saw in the previous graph, land cultivated only increased by 10%. The less positive side of things. It increased planting in monocultures. You've seen those pictures we've showed before of these huge areas of land that are basically one crop, one species. Reduced biodiversity over large areas. You only grow one crop, that's what happens. And that one crop, particularly in the developing world, is increasingly susceptible to disease. Reliance on single crops risks a catastrophic failure. And we'll talk about the Irish potato famine of 1845 in a later lecture, but just so you have a preview, we talked about the fact that potatoes were all pretty much started out in Peru, in the Andes, and that was still true that most varieties of potatoes started out there, were still largely farmed there, and a small blight affected the potato in a part early in 1845. Within 12 weeks it had spread to Europe because of the shipping practices at the time, and it had killed, the blight had killed all the potatoes in Ireland over this fairly short period of time, and people starved to death. Talk more about that later. So, adverse consequences of resource use. Remember those ecosystem services, the processes by which the environment produces resources. Clean air, water, timber, even fish. Yeah, fish are a resource. The supply of ecosystem services is constrained. It's limited by the ability of the environment to produce resources, its availability, and their usability. Waste often gets in the way. Contaminate the environment with harmful substances because we can't clean those up. Pollution can limit or disrupt how well ecosystems provide those essential resources and services. So how do biofuels, I've got an old clunker pickup truck that when they start putting ethanol in gasoline, it's mandated by the government, by the way, that 10% of all of our gasoline have ethanol in it. When they put 10% ethanol in the gasoline that I put in my truck, my gas mileage dropped by 10%. So where's the savings there? Ethanol is made from corn, sorghum, sugarcane primarily. They also have sugarcane, or egrass is another term for that. It's a different form of cane. It's supplemental to gasoline, mandated by the federal government, the rate of 10%. You see it on the gas pumps. Biodiesel is a little different animal. Any vegetable or animal fat can be burned in a diesel vehicle, directly in diesel engines. It's kind of an amazing thing. In 2008, the U.S. produced 9 billion gallons of ethanol. We produce more than that now. 700 million gallons of biodiesel. Biodiesel is any of those waste products too. Traditionally, biomass has been used for food, animal feed, fiber, and composting, cycling back to the environment, not to be put in gas tanks. Wood was the very first biofuel. I learned this a long time ago, obviously. Wood has been burned for, forever. That's the first thing we used because it was sustainable. It would regrow itself. We just don't think about that. Looking at biofuels as opposed to food crops. And this is the production of these corn and soybeans for biofuel. This is how much is converted to biofuels. In 1996, about 5% of all the corn produced was converted into biofuels. By 2007, 2008, whatever year you want to look at that, More than 25%, more than a quarter of the corn production and about 15% of the soybean production was dedicated to putting in gas tanks, essentially. Ethanol. Share of food crops converted to ethanol increased by, that's a huge number, 20%. Corn and vegetable prices higher than without ethanol production, but that doesn't mean farmers are getting more money for it. Biodiesel. Made from waste and non-edible biomass, almost anything. I look forward to this. They can also be produced by algae growing on animal waste ponds. I'd love to see more of that, because right now it's hard to get rid of that stuff. So what's a feedlot as opposed to free range, a free range animal? Well, world meat production increased tremendously, millions of tons from 1961 to 2011. Consumption of animal products is increasing. It's increased sixfold, from about 50 million up to 300 million tons per year. Mostly this is chickens. Per person, the meat consumption has doubled, though, much healthier than we used to be. As the developing world transitions to industrial economies, guess what? We'll be at 600 million tons by 2054. Consumption will double again in the next 40 years. That's a lot. We have to find some way of producing that, if indeed it's going to continue to increase. How else will we support our population if we don't continue to do that? So let's look at these things called cage-free chickens versus free-range chickens. Free-range chickens, what Grandma used to do it. So cage-free chickens, I mean, they're still in that cage, but the chickens are roaming around there in this chicken house. There's still a lot of chickens in there. That's touted as a positive model for how to grow chickens. This is how Grandma did it. You got the chickens, you got the coop, and they wander around and they basically eat whatever they can find out in the yard. Really, that's what they did. I remember having to avoid where you stepped when you went to Grandma's house because of the chickens. But this is how much of the world used to get their chickens and their protein. Sustainable ag practices vary in how much energy fossil fuels you have to put into it. Almost all of our food resources come from agriculture. Can't think of any that are not. However, we rely on only 15 plant and 8 animal species to produce most of our food supply. And you can probably name those. It's shocking. We used to eat a lot more, a wider variety. But globally, we've reduced it down to that. Nearly 11% of the Earth's land area is under cultivation. Another 25% is used for grazing livestock. Monoculture. We've talked about monocultures before. Community consisting of a single crop species. Polyculture, where you can get those things, is where you have a mixture of crops. So let's look at some animal conversion efficiencies. The efficiencies of animals to convert food into biomass, into animal fat. Can we feed the world in the 21st century without feedlots? Well, so there's a little graphic here. These are kilocalories of fossil fuel input per kilocalorie of protein output. And that top thing there is a feedlot beef cow. On the bottom are the vegetables. Feedlot beef cow takes, this is how much energy it takes. Fossil fuel input, 20 to 78 kilocalories of fossil fuel to get out 1 kilocalorie of protein. For pigs, it's 35. Chickens, 22. These are all pretty much raised in feedlots or in close quarters, confined to cages and things like that. When you look at the rangeland aspect of things, both cattle and lamb, we do eat lamb, it only takes 10 kilocalories of fossil fuel per kilocalorie of protein output. You still have to use some. Far more efficient is vegetables, 2 to 4 kilocalories of fossil fuel per kilocalorie of protein. 2006 study, livestock agriculture contributes 9% of our global carbon dioxide, 37% of our global methane use. Now we will learn a lot more about methane later because the science on that is changing a lot even as we speak. So love this class. 65% of our nitrous oxide emissions, more than from all the cars on the road combined. So we have to eat, but it certainly is adding a lot to our atmosphere. Look at fertilizers. They come in two flavors. The organic type, that's definitely horse manure, and the inorganic type. And you would think, well, what's that? That's actually an oil refinery. And that's where we get a lot of our inorganic fossil fuels, because essentially what you're doing when you pump that stuff out of the ground, you're pumping organic matter that was laid down millions of years ago. It still has the nutrients in it. Agricultural practices vary tremendously in how much energy has to be put into it. You can classify that production into an industrialized idea, that mechanized, high output. Got a lot of tractors running out there, lots of energy in the form of fossil fuels, inorganic fertilizers, irrigation systems, pesticides, etc. The low input, traditional, subsistence agriculture, primarily human labor, primarily that's how it gets done, draft animals, to provide only enough for a family to survive, or maybe a bit more than that. Dominant form of agriculture in the tropics, that's a good question. What is the difference among these types of agriculture? Well, slash and burn is where you go in and you cut everything down, and nothing then you plant crops in there, but you burn it to get the ash, and you just leave that and try to grow it as much as you can and move on to another plot. Then there's this idea of switching, where they move from one crop to another. And there's this thing called Swidden Agriculture, and this looks like they're about to burn that little the farmhouse down. But we'll talk more about this, but essentially it's a modified form of slash and burn. It's not the same as slash and burn. I think I got the idea from Swidden Agriculture. What is Swidden? Well, two of these, switching and Swidden, are a type of subsistence farming practiced in tropical regions. Involves rotating agriculture. So Swidden Ag in the tropics. What you have, when you start off, when you first burn a plot, you gain a fair amount of total nitrogen, and then over the course of a year you actually grow crops, and then you abandon the field, and then you allow it to recover over this period of time. So trees are cut down and burned to clear the land for planting. Ash is high in those mineral nutrients, while the soil in the tropics in particular is not. The plot is cultivated and the crops are harvested. Each successive harvest experiences decline in productivity. The nutrients are removed as you go along. Eventually that site is abandoned, allowed to revert back to its natural vegetation. It takes about, I think, 16 years for that to happen. Left undisturbed for sufficient time, nutrient status recovers. So this is an example of years after clearing by burning, before you can actually lose all use of the land. Cotton in the southern Sudan, you can go for a few years. Percent yield is 100% the first year. By the fourth year, it's dropped down to 40%. Corn, maize in Honduras, you see a similar decline. All these are very similar. Zaire, the same. Manoic, I'm not sure what manoic is. Rice in Malaysia, you see the same decline. The biggest declines are rice and groundnut in Zaire, where you get 1 year maybe. You can push it to 2. So this is just an idea, a vision of Swidden agriculture, where newly cleared for planting here in the foreground, let it grow for 1 year of fallow, and this is, in the background, is that 16 years later regenerating forest. I'm going to cut it down then. It is definitely the dominant form of agriculture in the tropics. Swidden cultivation represents a sustainable form of ag, when time is permitted to regrowth of that natural vegetation and regeneration of those nutrients. They soil nutrients. Nutrients are basically from the trees that grow there. Many parts of the tropics, too many people. People are placing increasing stresses on the land. And then you get big business. Misinformation. A lot of sensitive tropical areas have been irreparably damaged. They've been converted from tropical rainforests to, well, grasslands because they've been cut down and they can't produce nearly as much as they used to. Looking at industrialized agriculture, that's a nice plowed field we're all familiar with. It's practiced where takes money to clear all this. It takes a lot of dollars to get a field that cleared and that leveled. Land are available. Those machines and fossil fuel energy are much greater in their energy use than humans and draft animals. Mechanization, lots of land, takes lots of land to turn those tractors. We saw that in the picture of the Kansas field. Requires a large expanse of land to be effective and economically feasible. Kind of eliminates the small farmer. Kind of. You have specialized equipment, monoculture or continuous rotation, because you're not going to have a bunch of different machines to go out there and you're going to keep, you have something to harvest soybeans, or something to harvest cotton, or something to harvest corn, and not more than that because machines are expensive. Okay, the idea of no-till, where we have this a network of biopores, and plants, seeds are planted by drilling, and you have this, the roots go much deeper. High-till, different idea. The other thing about no-till is that there's this basically organic layer left on top. Almost all parts of the plant are removed in high-till. You take out all that stuff. Little to no organic matter remains after that harvest. At each harvest, you got to replace that nutrient. This is in the Great Plains where the soils are really rich. Nutrients are removed and not naturally replaced. So, this is approximate amounts of nutrients in various parts of a crop. Let's just look at corn, for example. Okay, the grain part of the corn, really, as far as nitrogen is concerned, 151 kilograms per hectare. But if you add in the stover, that leftover, the stalks and all that stuff that you also harvest if you do traditional harvesting, all that, or you remove that, you're taking away nutrients. You're taking away phosphorus. You're taking away potassium. You're taking away calcium, magnesium, that normally, if you left that stuff there, it would be much healthier for the soil and for the plant to grow in the future. The same is true with rice, actually almost to a greater extent, in certain nutrients, particularly potassium and calcium. You do the same thing with wheat. There's more energy in actually the wheat straw than there is in the wheat plant itself. Well, that's true for all these, isn't it? Yeah. Look at it. So, that is nutrients lost when their plants are harvested using traditional agriculture. Essentially, industrial ag does not effectively cycle nutrients. You got to put a lot of chemical fertilizers back on that land to maintain that productivity. Inorganic nutrient forms are readily available to plants, also readily leachable. In other words, inorganic forms, not the same as organic forms, are more bound. Pests and plant diseases spread rapidly because of monocultures. Pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, all these sides, multiple sides. There's a lot of other environmental problems go along with those things. We'll talk a lot more about this in a later lecture, more than one. Looking at nutrient inputs in precipitation and fertilizers. So, you get about 10 kilograms per hectare per year in precipitation of nitrogen in soil. They have to add 160 kilograms per hectare per year in fertilizer. When you harvest this, you're removing, well, you put in 170, you're only harvesting 60, so that leaves about, that's probably an underestimate how much actually runs off to stream. Same way with calcium, phosphorus, get a lot more runoff to streams. So 10% of what they put on the land runs off to streams. Adds greatly to cultural eutrophication, which we've talked about before, particularly in lakes. So this is kind of a look at the economics, the energy inputs for these two systems. Trade-off, heavy energy input and production, which is what this traditional chemistry is. There's very little labor involved in terms of the energy input in the traditional energy used for industrial ag versus the energy used for more traditional ag. So energy input and production versus the energy you get back. Corn production in Mexico, this is manual, versus United States. Corn production, this is kilocalories per hectare, 642,000 kilocalories per hectare needed. Most of that is in labor up at the top for manually operating, manually growing crops. Same amount of land. Versus, that's 11,036,650 kilocalories per hectare. Most of that is in, well, machinery, got a fair amount of it in irrigation, a bunch of it in electricity, all those things that are not present in that manual labor. Same amount of land. Inorganic fertilizer has all kinds of consequences. Cultural eutrophication, you get that nutrient enrichment of aquatic systems. High in nitrates and phosphates. Groundwater contamination from chemical fertilizers. I use Lake Denton example. Lake Denton is a small lake that is near South Florida State College, and it is very clear water, but it has very low levels of the nutrient phosphorus, but it has, because of groundwater contamination from chemical fertilizers from the surrounding agriculture, it has very high levels of nitrogen in it, very high levels. High concentrations of nitrate are known to pose health risks, particularly in newborns, young children. Losing that cover, in other words, getting rid of all that organic matter that used to be left, increases the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So how do we balance the needs of the many versus the work of the few? Kind of a twist there on Spock, but bear with me. Increasing agricultural production to meet the growing human need can be accomplished, well, at least two ways. You can increase the amount of land under production, which we really haven't done since the 1960s. Increase the production of food per unit land area, which is what we actually have done. That's what the Green Revolution is all about. 20th century, the amount of land area under production has actually dropped. Built more cities, also ruined some of the land. So this is an idea, this is an image of world grain harvested from 1950 to 1996, and the amount of land dedicated to it has been almost the same. Land mass. But when you look at the amount harvested per capita per person, that has declined, while the amount of nitrogen use has increased over that same period, dramatically increased over that same period of time. So there's a trade-off between sustainability and productivity. And why has that land under production declined? Because we have a greatly increasing use of chemical fertilizers, especially nitrogen. Much of the nitrogen used by the world's crops, protein derived from it, comes from an artificial process. The Haber-Bosch process, we'll have an assignment on that much later in this course. Nitrogen bomb, said, look more on this in future lectures. I'm not talking about a bomb they drop on people, other kinds of bombs. Feeding the world's growing population now depends upon industrialized agriculture. We don't have a choice. Task: minimize the environmental impacts of industrialized practice. We do have a choice here. This is where modern techniques, where we can greatly improve how we do things. Sustainable industrial agriculture is possible. Depends upon a variety of methods. Farming systems are capable of maintaining productivity and usefulness to society while also conserving resources. It can be done. We learned about, briefly, soil conservation methods in the previous lecture. Reducing the use of pesticides is another important aspect of this. Alternative sources of soil nutrients. Composting is a big one. And water conservation and protection of water resources, also very important. So which of these is more sustainable? When you alternate crops or coming with a no-till monoculture? Well, they're both great ideas and they're both something that's practiced. This no-till, all that organic matter is left there in the rows between the plants. It's not actually removed. It adds, stabilizes the soil and reduces the amount of extra fertilizer you have to use. So why not both? Yeah. So, we looked at sustainable resource use, the balance between supply and demand. Race to feed the world. How we do that? Through the green revolution. Sustainability can be limited by those adverse consequences of resource use, using it up faster than it regenerates itself, so we have to supplement things. And the comparison of biofuels production versus feeding people. Where should our priorities be? Now, we didn't talk much about that, but it's an interesting question. So, feedlots versus free range. Sustainable ag and the developing world. How is it done? Sustainable practices. Sometimes organic fertilizers might be better if you can get enough of them. Swidden ag versus industrial ag, and that self-sufficiency idea. And there's a trade-off between sustainability and productivity. The fisheries assignment. There's now a content section assignment for that. It actually includes a brief lecture, just kind of introducing the information. See the content section, put your answers in the drop box for that one. And don't forget the pop quiz. Pop quiz, food deserts. Turn in the answer before 7 a.m. on the last day of Unit 3, which is in the syllabus. These are the references for this particular lecture. Also, see the annotations of the images noted in the previous slides.